Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Steve Ambrose, Chief Content Officer at SignalOps. I'll be your host for the next hour. I want to thank you all for being here. We've got a great session lined up for you and want to give you a little bit more on what to expect. Over the next hour, we're going to talk about the future of work and specifically the new economics of how people and AI actually get coordinated inside a company. Now, you're going to hear thinking behind it, and you'll watch it run on a real decision start to finish. It's part big ideas, part live demonstration, and all of it's going to be built for the people who have to make these calls. Let me go ahead and start by introducing the folks who are going to be with you today. Now, these are the leaders and subject matter experts from the SignalOps team. First, Raj Ronanki, our CEO. Then Jeff Klebanoff, General Manager of Enterprise Markets. Then Art Fitz, Healthcare and AI Expert. Plamen Petrov, our Chief Architect and General Manager of Trust Zones. Then we're going to go to Emily Binder, who's our Chief Marketing Officer. And finally, Praveen Samaneni, who is Senior Vice President and Chief Engineering Officer. Now, they're here to educate and to inform, and they're going to answer your questions over the next hour. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Raj Ronanki, our CEO. Raj, take it away.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone to our webinar. Looking forward to the next hour and really having an interactive discussion with all of you. And as Steve mentioned, the questions are welcome and look forward to getting many of those. But before we get started, I did promise on LinkedIn this morning that there were going to be a couple of surprise announcements. One of which is that Art Fitz, who's a longtime veteran in the healthcare industry, has run claims operations to introducing AI to claims, as well as everything in the middle in all things related to healthcare and AI, has decided to join SignalOps, and he's going to be leading our healthcare markets as our general manager. So welcome, Art, to Signal, and look forward to exciting times ahead, and also your panel a little bit later with Emily. So before we get started, I want to introduce you to a few terms because we'll be using these terms over the course of the presentation today, and I thought it'd be useful to ground everyone in kind of the definition of these things. So we often talk about signals, and I can't remember every time I talk about signal, the first question I get is, well, what exactly is a signal? Is it data? Is it something else? How do you define it? So think of signal as any piece of information that carries the power of action. So if a weather forecast comes in and says, hey, it's going to rain in the next hour, and therefore you need to take an umbrella, that's power of action that contained within that bit of information. So that's a signal. So think of it in that context as anything that can ultimately influence a decision and influence an outcome, ultimately drives the power of action. And attention, which we define as the thing that you need to focus on. And as intelligence becomes ubiquitous and as compute keeps getting cheaper and you have more data, you have more dashboards, to cut through all that clutter, we have to focus on the things that are scarce, i.e. the attention that enterprises need to allocate to problems, as well as, what do you want your agents to be paying attention to as well, which is an emerging, problem that we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the presentation. A few other definitions before we dive into the content. One is people often ask, what is SignalOps? Is it a business analytics company? Is it is it an AI company? What is it? Is it a platform? So we're introducing what we're calling a new category. So for decades now, we've had systems of record which store the ground truth of any operational system. We've had systems of insights and analytics, which turn operational realities into information and insights. And then systems of engagement for the last 20 years or so, i.e. your portals, your apps, and ways in which your customers, members, users interact with the systems of record or systems of insight. But there isn't anything that says, well, how do you categorize things that are that you need to pay attention to? And hence this new category that we're calling systems of attention, where the unit of record is not data. If you think about it, systems of record, systems of insight, systems of engagement are all built up on a sort of ground up from data. Whereas what we're building is based entirely on signals, and it's a top-down system. So think of decisions down to signals, and the software that creates all of the action in the middle is what we're creating. And then a couple of terms that are related to our IP. SignalOS is our user experience that anyone is able to use to ultimately make the decisions that we would be proposing to do so. And then Signal Graph is our coordination engine. So think of all the things that need to get correlated via Blackboard architecture. There's a proprietary piece of technology that we're developing called Signal Graph. So think of that as something that sits on top of LLM built on the RAG and the knowledge graphs of a LLM, and then top of that, create the context and ultimately correlate that to signals to create the graph that we now define as Signal Graph, part of our patent that we filed as well. In addition, there are four primitives that are somewhat common across every use case that we take on, across any industry for that matter. And then a little bit later on, Jeff will share a demo in which some of these terms will be referenced. So signal, I already defined. Think of equilibrium as the thermostat that you would put on any process. So for example, if you go to bed tonight and you set your temperature at 67, that temperature is gauged at that level and is always your air conditioning systems work to make sure that the air circulates at that temperature. But how do you define that for a process? Whether it's a prior auth or it's pricing, for a logistics and transportation sector, there's a certain bandwidth in which a process needs to operate. But rarely, if ever, can you actually see if there's something deviating from that metric. So we define equilibrium as the thing that sets the bounds for the healthy operation of a process. And then when something deviates from that equilibrium, we have an attention allocation mechanism that routes the action that needs to be taken as a result of the drift to the appropriate stakeholders within an enterprise. That could be a service desk team that needs to respond to an outage, or it could be a CFO that's looking at a financial plan that's off track. And all of those things are ways in which we route attention to the appropriate stakeholders within the enterprise. And then there's a certain budget for that, given that there's only so many things you can take on in any given day. And how do you prioritize and make sure that the right things get attended to? So that's the concept of the attention budget. And then finally, institutional memory. So think of all of the knowledge of all of the knowledge workers and everyone that does work across the enterprise. The knowledge is currently captured in SharePoint, OneDrives, the Teams, Slacks, emails, in addition to, all the systems that an enterprise has. But there's nothing that sort of concretely captures decision outcomes, the rationale for it, what was the context of the decision, and then have the benefit of having those decisions cataloged over time so that whenever we see a recurring pattern, we can go back and tap into the enterprise memory to see, what the result was when we encountered a situation like this in the past, and we made a decision to, in a certain way, and all the pros and cons and all the outcomes of that are recorded, with complete rationale in order for us to be able to track all of that. So those are the four things that will always be sort of present in every use case, wrapped around our SignalOS, and then ultimately coordinated through Signal Graph. So that's sort of the primer on the IP of the company. So now let's dive into specifically the topic that we want to introduce as a part of this webinar, which is the future of work. And before we dive into the specifics of the software itself, I want to set the stage on why we decided to create this offering. So as we all know now, intelligence is ubiquitous. It's hardly a day goes by when you don't see some news of if a new model, a new capability, a new architecture, a new chip that was just announced by OpenAI. So it is available to everyone. And when the intelligence, therefore, is a commodity in the sense that it's so widely available, then what is it that differentiates one company to the next? Obviously, there's data, there's distribution, and all the historical advantages. But the edge ultimately collapses down to one thing and one thing alone, which is of all the things that come across your channels, what do you pay attention to? And then the systems that we've built in the last era, whether it's systems of record, systems of insight and analytics, systems of engagement, they're all important, but they're not directed towards attention. And that is an entirely inadequate set of existing systems that aren't surfacing this problem. And that's the problem we're trying to fix, which is how do we allocate the attention of the enterprise in the appropriate manner? So now let's take that frame of attention and look at something that we've all had a point of view on, which is what happens to the future of work, and by extension, what happens to the future of jobs. So I was doing this research and preparing for this webinar, and so in 2025, the U.S. economy breaks down into roughly $15 trillion, of which goes towards people's wages and the associated economy around that. So if you break that down, part of that labor force is working on doing things. So whether it's your Amazon driver that's delivering things, or it's your engineer programming things, or your tester, doing a QA on something, or a customer service agent answering a phone call from a customer. So think of those category of jobs is where AI will make you more productive. And whether that's 10% or 50%, 70%, that productivity curve is inevitably underway, and it's been underway for likely the last 20 plus years as things have evolved from robotic process automation to now full agentic AI systems. And then on the bookend of that is the judgment and the direction. So what strategies do we pick? Which direction do we go? What do we do with decisions? And it's ultimately a very human thing, which is innately about your judgment. And judgment in the context of an enterprise, which has to account for cultural things and other enterprise norms. And in the middle is really the coordination layer, if you will, which is best described as, in some ways, described as middle management, which has been carrying the load of really deciding what the attention, or rather what the enterprise needs to pay attention to. So coordinate the work of the teams below, and then inform the layer above on what needs to happen. That ultimately, I think, is the question at hand: is what happens to that layer when AI starts to automate at scale, and does it ultimately go down to zero? And our view is that it likely will be close to zero, which is that coordination and the shuffling of work and the routing of work could be automated through agentic and AI systems. And therefore, that layer needs to be reimagined into something that serves the purpose of the enterprise differently than it does today. So we're not saying that ultimately the 3 trillion plus jobs that would be categorized as coordination and management need to go away, but it needs to be reimagined for the AI era, which is demonetize that layer as you think of it now, and start to accrue the value differently in terms of think of it as the layer now that needs to be thinking about allocating attention to the enterprise, so that as new opportunities emerge, new business strategies need to be formulated. That layer now then directs the attention to the right things at the right time, and make sure that the enterprise's attention is focused on the things that drive the maximum results and the outcomes. So it's a critical layer, but it needs a rethink and a reimagine on how it needs to be performed. And that is in fact what we're defining as the future of work, where AI and humans working together need to direct the attention of the enterprise appropriately. And our software, SignalOS, we believe is the control pane for allocating that attention. So now let's step back for a second. So there is an idea that is underneath all of this, which is tied to a whole field called decision economics, which has a simple claim, which that value comes from putting scarce resources behind the right calls. Decide better, allocate better, and figure out what needs to happen next within the enterprise. But every one of those decisions gets gated by a single input, and that single input is what do you actually pay attention to? And so in some ways, the decision economics and the attention economics aren't two separate things. You could almost think of it as the one and the same thing in the sense that if you allocate attention well, And then the numbers and the results kind of take care of themselves in some ways. So which begs the question, right? So what is the system underneath that needs to make that happen? And that's where we're introducing and what we built, and we're calling it SignalOps. So think of SignalOps as a product offering that sits within the SignalOps product stack, focused on one thing, which is the joint operations of talent and tokens. So we use tokens as a proxy for AI because it's the economic unit of value today. And talent has always been the economic value for labor. So if you put those two things together, we now have an operating system that we need to build for the workforce of the future, which is what we want to introduce you today. And so let's start with something that's already happening. And so if you think about your traditional org chart, that is now quickly being blended with synthetic as well as carbon beings. And I think Mark Benioff famously said that this is the last generation where there's only going to be humans on the org chart. Going forward, every company will have agents on its org chart. And so you're already running a blended workforce. So the headcount you measure, is no longer about the capacity just based on human labor, but also think about the capacity that's available to you with agents. But how do we manage all of this together? What's the cost of that workforce that is now largely invisible on typical business plans and payrolls is lurking underneath the surface, buried in cloud ops, FinOps, and everywhere else, but it's quickly emerging to be a significant cost item that needs to be managed together as you would your workforce. So think of humans and tokens together, being the workforce of the future, and SignalOps as the mechanism by which you can manage all that. So here's how it actually works. So think of SignalOps as your one unifying pane that kind of bridges all of the HRIS information, the HR information together with what we're getting from the AI and the agentic layer together, where you start to take every decision and decompose those decisions into projects and tasks as you would do anything else. Staff and task each task to the right mix of people and agents. Route the work, to the appropriate stakeholders, and price every decision. What's the cost of inaction? What's the cost of a two-way decision? What's the cost of an irreversible decision? So that we're entirely clear on the economics of every decision that's happening, supported and enabled by the talent and token pools that make up the workforce. They're on tap. How do you route, allocate, and manage that workforce is really the offering that we're creating. And then I'll leave you with this before we get into the demo that Jeff recorded for us, which is that now every action that we take is an implied decision, and the price of every decision is attention. It's not compute, it's not labor, it's not whether or not an action can be undone or reversibility. Ultimately, attention is the thing. It's not a soft skill or a buzzword. It is the very thing, it's the foundational thing on which you build everything else, which is why we're calling it infrastructure. And that is the work that we want to do with all of you. And to explain this further, I'll cue a video from Jeff that lays this all out for you.
Thanks so much, Raj. And really excited to be able to take you through an actual example where SignalOS is going to help Meridian Regional Bank in order to transform its organization from a regional bank to a digitally enabled relationship national bank. I'm Jeffrey Klebanoff, General Manager of Enterprise Markets, and really excited to take you through this demo today. Meridian Regional Bank, again, is a regional bank focused on being branch-led. Its capital is tied to all of its legacy model and systems. All of its operations are focused on manual processes, and it's very reactive to regulations. Decisions are very slow, and they're all based on stale data. It has set forth on a strategic journey where it has 5 strategic pillars that are going to enable this change. Focus on capital allocation, where it wants to redeploy their balance sheet towards national growth. a workforce transformation, which we will key into during today's demo and focus on how SignalOS can actually help them drive the future of their work. Automation, they want to make sure they have much more automated straight-through operations in order to drive the cost down to those they serve. They want to be a very digital distributed organization where they're able to acquire and serve nationally beyond their branch. And they want to make sure that all risk data and compliance is served via one platform to ensure that they can actually scale what they have to do for things like Basel III. Tomorrow, this bank, after they do all of these things, they'll make sure their capital is redeployed to growth, they'll have real-time operations, and all risk will be within the guardrails. Decisions will be in minutes, and that memory will compound with something called institutional memory, which we will talk to in a moment. This is all based on the 4 seats that are going to be steering this change. The CEO is focused on, are we still delivering what this bank was built for? The CFO is very focused on the value and what's the ROI. The CTO is focused on what do we automate and what does it actually cost to automate? And the CHRO, who owns the people strategy, is looking for the optimal workforce to enable this change. Now I'm going to take you actually into the platform so we can see it at work. This is the Workforce Signal application. We're at step 1. So the first thing that every organization needs to do as it pertains to driving transformation is set the plan. We need to make sure we are focused on what we're assuming and also understand how those assumptions play into what you're actually going to be moving forward on. In this situation, we've loaded a couple of different documents. So we have the Workforce 3-year plan and we have a headcount glide path. So those are the 2 pieces of information that are critical as the assumptions are decided on in order to set the plan. The SignalOS reads the plan for things that we often take for granted, things like timelines, things like market conditions, internal capacity, and it actually converts those into watch items that the Signal operating system will be focused on. Some of the assumptions that we're focused on here are there's a regulatory window that is focused on 36 months, reskilling, and we can change this, but in this instance we're saying can take up to 5 months. You can hire how many risk engineers that are necessary in this instance by the end of Q2. So this is something that they need in order to have a more risk-enabled workforce. There's also a cost to the AI automation. This is really important because as you'll see as we go through this demo, a lot of times as companies are thinking about the future work, they're not always thinking about what the cost of automation is. They're very focused on, hey, if I automate, I can remove staff. And what they don't often balance is what was the cost of the headcount as opposed to what's the ultimate cost as it pertains to the storage cost, the compute cost, and the different tokens that you're going to actually have to pay for once you automate. Another assumption is, and this is a critical one, the workforce cost has to stay within the budget. And they also want to make sure that any attribution, especially the most regrettable one, stays under 8%. So once this gets set and all of these are confirmed, we actually move forward with setting the plan. Now this is where you can see, before we started this engagement, there was a blueprint that was developed, which actually drove the configuration of this platform. And when that blueprint was developed, it was, what are the systems and sources of information that we want to bring in as it pertains to the data we want to ingest? And in this instance, there were 6 connected sources, and they are live. So there was a core banking platform that's actually providing real-time updates. There's a risk and compliance platform, which is providing daily updates. There's your HRIS platform of Workday. You have your ATS recruiting system, Greenhouse. Both of those also real-time. You have a regulatory feed, and this is where you actually have external information coming in, and that's happening daily. And then there's also market intelligence that's happening hourly. So you can see you've got internal and external signals that are critical, that are being watched in order to drive what the focus is of the platform. Then we have the equilibrium. So this is what must stay true in order to proceed and in order to make sure that the attention is being routed appropriately. There's things like output capacity here. How do you make sure that the output that's being produced by the workforce is high? You want to make sure that, as we just talked about, the labor costs and the AI costs stay balanced. It's critical. You want to make sure you have capability that's covered. So you want to ensure that your people-based workforce and any agent-based workforce is driving the capabilities that you must cover in order to stay in business and continue to grow your business. You want to also make sure that the culture is happy. You want to make sure the engagement scores from a cultural perspective stay high. You also need to make sure from a regulatory assumption perspective, and this was one of the thresholds that were driven at the beginning of this build, that you act if anything crosses the 70% threshold. And you also look at, you want to make sure your total budget remains under that $10.3 million mark. routing rules were developed, and this is really important. So this is who gets told when something happens that drives attention based on the alerts coming out of equilibrium based on the signals we just talked about. If there is a regulatory risk, we want to make sure that the CFO, the CHRO, and the CTO are all aware of it. If there's any type of value drift, we want to make sure the CHRO and the finance are up to speed. If there's a balance breach, right, in this instance where you've got AI that's costing more than a labor cost, you want to ensure the CFO knows about that, because you may need to decide, do you stop the automation? Do you think about what you're doing from a workforce perspective? Decisions need to be made. You want to make sure if there's any hiring SLA breach that your TA operations team, so your talent acquisition team, is notified within 48 hours. And then you also want to make sure if there's any adverse impact, compliance is made aware. And what you can see here is how each of the different levers that you want to drive to actually drive the different outputs and outcomes we just talked about can be moved. So you can look at things like adjusting your hiring pace. You can basically go to a hiring freeze and you can see what that does as far as the labor and AI balance. Or you can expand that and you can see that that ultimately changes. You can see the output capacity grows. You can see that the culture grows because the culture is happy because there's a higher hiring pace of full-time employees. You can do the same thing with reskilling, right? So I'm investing more in my people. People are happier, output of capacity. If I lower this is what actually starts to impact some of my engagement and culture scores. There's also the labor and people cost. Again, you can look at this and say, hey, we're going to go below. What you see here is if we're reducing the amount of people, this is where the engagement as well as the labor and AI balance starts to get in the red. So these are all things that you can kind of move to see the impact of how these levers ultimately get impacted. So now we want to start watching. So what's happened here is, so we've set the plan. We've put forth what we're going to do as far as what our annualized plan was for our workforce. We've been watching for 3 months. And what happened here was something happened. There were lines that were crossed. We actually are seeing from a regulatory signals perspective, you actually have 2 of those signals that are going over and above that 70% threshold we just talked about. What this is telling you is we have to actually act. Something has to happen. And now you can see the 5 signals that are actually driving what's happening here. And so it's actually telling you which signals are the ones you need to focus on. So when you look through the 5 signals on the right, so the Federal Reserve Basel III reproposal, opt-out is eliminated for banks at 100 billion plus. So that's at 21% plus. So that's not an issue as it pertains to your equilibrium, what you need to focus on. The Senate Banking Committee testimony, the bipartisan support for accelerated timeline, also coming out of C-SPAN, transcript externally, is also at 14% in the good. The 2 that you really need to focus on are the 4 major bank earning calls that flagged AOCI volatility exposure as a material risk, and also the NACHA rule 2026 in April fraud monitoring enforcement date pulled forward to Q3 of 2027. Both of those are what is actually driving the estimated $10 million workforce impact. And this is where you need to pay attention to, because that's what's driving your threshold from being impacted over and above the 70% that you set at the beginning. So what do we do next? SignalOS raises the alert. And what it starts to do now is it tells the folks who need to know what's going on that something has happened. Attention is required. There's a signal that is being required to make sure that each of the different seats that we talked about are aware of what's going on and how they need to make sure they're addressing that. It tells you the signal, it tells you the likelihood, it tells you the workforce exposure, it tells you what equilibrium is out of balance, and it also gives you the decision window of how many days you can actually do to resolve the situation. And then these different folks, the CFO, the CHRO, the CTO, and the CRO, they also have to focus on, what does this mean to us? CFO wants to know, if automation is now costing more than our labor, do we still build it or do we shift to people? The CHRO says, can we reskill the risk analysts in 12 months? Well, what do we do from a contingent perspective if we can't? The CTO is looking and saying, what technology do we need to change first to actually address these risks? And the CHRO, the Chief Risk Officer, is saying, what's the penalty exposure if we miss the enforcement window? So then we convene the room of folks that actually need to be involved in these decisions. So this is where we get to see if SignalOS, again, the scenario, the synopsis. After 12 weeks, we had the assumption there's something that was broken as it pertained to the AI forward mix, and it's actually showing that automation is costing more than the labor it was meant to replace. So there's three ways to respond to this. And this is what SignalOS is providing you. SignalOS is saying, well, you could build the automation anyway. Well, the risk here is high and the automation cost spikes over budget. So this is where it's actually going to be an $11.4 million cost, which is over your original budget. Option C, we could outsource the automation. Now in this instance, you would have a lower cost, but the ACH penalty tail is even bigger that could then now offset your budget because you have the potential to have another $3.2 million exposure, which again puts you in the red of something that could be an issue. Option B is what's recommended by SignalOS, and this is where it's recommending rebalance the labor and reskill. There's moderate risk on this one. The cost is right in line, but it does depend on the reskilling speed. So there's questions that are going to be asked here. So the CFO is asking, why do we trust the 78%? We've been wrong on regulatory timing before, and we've already committed to the AI build. Why pivot now? SignalOS is going to weigh in and actually tell you, well, the three independent reads point the same way. The Fed reproposal text, the bipartisan Senate testimony, and the prediction market at 78%. In March, they disagreed. That's why it's sat at 20%. They've now converged. On the pivot, the AI build's cost advantage was the entire premise. At the 12-month horizon, that advantage is gone. Rushing it costs more than people would, so the sunk cost isn't the reason to keep over-automating. The cheaper path now runs through labor. So SignalOS is actually providing the answer to the CFO based on the question it's asking. The CFO now is saying, fine, on a cost perspective, it does look like it's the cheapest and it keeps the build off our books, but what's the actual penalty? And again, this is where it lays out. SignalOS tells you what that estimated window is. So it's really showing you, as I just mentioned, there's an 11.4 million if you have that highest base risk scenario of that penalty. The CHRO is in agreement that option B is the right direction, but the reskilling assumption is off. Our real risk domain upskilling time is 10 months. So if the cohort slips, we lose the buffer. Can we rerun it at 10 months? SignalOS will make sure that you understand what this means. This means now the cost does move to 10.1 million. So it is a little bit over the budget. The suggestion actually now SignalOS gives you is to do a front loading of the 60-person cohort into the first 1 to 4 months. This is a way that, again, SignalOS is addressing that miss. And it's also saying, why don't we dial back automation spend to where it still pays? So SignalOS is basically reasoning with these C-level folks on the best way to address their concerns. The CTO now comes in. This is where he's also saying that the build order works. To automate the Basel risk engine, that's the longest build, but it still pays for itself. The ACH stays with people and the consulting firm rather than a rushed automation push. The right work to each side of the mix. SignalOS says, yep, that's exactly right. We're going to record this decision. We're going to update the workforce plan. We're going to rebalance toward labor. So basically, in this instance, we're saying it's a $10.1 million decision. We avoid the regulatory exposure. We stay within budget. We also save this to memory. So this is where that institutional memory comes in and the clock restarts. So this is what we've seen. SignalOS actually helped in a 47-minute time period of making a decision that at times would take weeks potentially to make. To get you to your optimal dollar amount, it's showing you where the outcomes were within the band, it's showing you the likelihood at the alert, it's showing you will have no compliance breaches if you focus on this. Historically, a dashboard will tell you it broke, whereas with SignalOS, in this instance, it's showing you an operating system kept us whole. Thanks so much and hope you enjoyed the demo of our SignalOS platform.
Thank you, Jeff. Don't you wish you had the system when you were running your transformation initiatives in your previous life?
Absolutely, Raj. It's definitely one of those things that I think about my 26 years in working transformation that it would have been a bit of a game changer for me when I was running those programs.
Indeed. Look, we've been hearing this term tokenomics, and at first I thought the Jim Rose came up with a term like protein maxing and applying to tokens. But I think it's a bit more serious than that, right? So on the one hand, if you hear Uber saying, look, we got to meter these token usage and then kind of reduce that. Microsoft saying, turn off cloud code. We ourselves are monitoring our, token spend on engineering and how that's all adding up. what's your take on this? You know, the way that you framed it in the demo was, hey, look, we're going to be able to monitor the cost of both. But what's the strategy beyond, you know, just cost management, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a broader challenge everyone's thinking about, to your point, Raj, is when we say we have to put AI in place and we have to put agentics in place and we have to think about how does that affect our future of work and that hybrid model of people and agents. As you heard in the demo, you have to think about what does that mean at the beginning of the process, right? How do we make sure we're actually thinking about that cost to automate? Because I think a lot of folks are saying, well, if I reduce my headcount, I'm going to save money. But if you don't have that balanced approach that SignalOS can really think about is how do I actually plan for that from a cost perspective, but also from a morale perspective, and also from a how do I continue to sustain my organization? You're missing sort of the broader, token economic and human economics that you talked about in the beginning. And that's where SignalOS can really help you because it can make sure it's thinking about all the different signals and factors that go into making that decision. So you can think about that optimal workforce both in the short, mid, and longer term, which is the critical piece a lot of these companies are facing.
So I think what you're saying, Jeff, is that so back in the cloud days when we were picking, you know, do we go multi-cloud, single cloud, and I think more or less everyone's sort of coalesced around the fact that you need to have more than one option in order to not lock in with any one vendor. AI, I think that strategy is playing out sort of live theater. You know, I think some companies have chosen to go down and say, let's partner with Frontier Lab XYZ, and then that's kind of our preferred partner because it's hard to retrain the models on sort of the huge cost of inference that you accrue if you're retraining the model. Excuse me, you're retraining using your data to retrain the models, you know, every so often. And swapping out sort of AIs does require a lot of retraining, which ultimately represents a lot of, you know, one-time cost, potentially ongoing costs. So what do you think should be the tension of which model to use for what purpose? How do we sort of look at the economics of those kind of models, right? Some are more token efficient, some aren't, and you know, not every model that publishes a new release may in fact change that economic profile. And then there's also the labor cost that you're sort of triaging as you were showing in your demo. So put all together, like what's the game plan in terms of is there a single strategy? What's the outcome and the optimal way in which all this should be managed?
You gave me a simple second question, Raj, so definitely appreciate that. So, what I would say is you really have to focus at the beginning on the problem you're trying to solve. And honestly, like before you even go to what is the right software, what is the right model, what is the right vendor, you have to really key in on that. It's really important because at the end of the day, that's the critical decision, right? What are the outcomes I'm driving towards? What am I actually trying to solve for my organization? I think a lot of times people rush to that decision of, well, I'm going to be an OpenAI shop, I'm going to be an Anthropic shop. And those are interesting decisions that may be the right ultimate answer. But I think it's a hybrid because ultimately, as you're thinking through the problems you're trying to solve, as you're assessing the data that you have and sort of the quality of that data, you're assessing your architecture, you're assessing the integration that you might have to deal with. You have to understand all that because you really need that sort of optimal mix of models and vendors to drive the right, as you said, token economics for what it's going to cost you, those outcomes you want to drive, and really thinking about sort of the fastest way to get there in the most thoughtful, I'm going to call it risk averse way. And I think that's the way SignalOS can really help you because it's really giving you all that information and proactively prepare for what a lot of companies right now are reactively dealing with.
Yep, well said. Steve, I'll turn it back over to you.
This is a really good time now to take a sort of a pause and talk a little bit about next steps here for all attendees. One of the things that you're going to hear now and at the end of our hour is the importance of us being able to meet with you and talk with you and have a working session and demo with you specific to your company's challenges and also your data that you're holding now and where we're able to find the value that can be delivered in the best possible way through SignalOS. And so the prompt here is to please go to signallabs.ai. Remember the .ai ending on the URL and just click the demo button. And from there, you'll be able to quickly put in your information and our team will get back to you promptly. In our first month of being open and running, we met with more than 50 different organizations, and I can tell you that there is a lot that we're able to bring through this technology, as Raj mentioned. So again, when you do get a chance at the end of the webinar, please do go to signallabs.ai, hit the demo button. And we're going to roll right now into questions. I can tell you that we have been getting them in fast and furious here. So what I'd like to do is let's just go ahead in here and I'll start rolling them in. The first is, when your system enters a completely new situation, new org structure, new type of signal, new market condition, and there's no historical pattern to learn from, what does the routing fall back to? Is it just manual configuration? So I'll put that to the panel. Someone can jump in.
Yeah, Steve, I can take a first crack at that, right? So I think by definition, so let's take the bank example that Jeff was walking us through. So let's say one of the proposals that's I think that's being discussed in the Senate is whether this should be a tax on data centers. So think of the energy and the power utility, et cetera. Should there be an excise tax on it? So if that happens, then likely that tax will be passed on via the AI companies to all the enterprises, right? So suddenly the economics of what what you're contemplating is likely to change as a result of that tax. So, well, that's a signal. We're tracking it now, in the sense that it's going through the Senate. The outcome of that's going to somewhat depend on the midterm elections. We're looking at the poly markets, but there's no historical precedent for it, because AI as a utility is not taxed in the same sense that people are. So what do you do with that? So what we do with it is that gets routed into sort of in that banking example, into the CFO, CEO, to the CHRO and the CTO, so that they can convene and say, look, we need to replan, not that we have to account for an added 20% cost that's above and beyond what was not previously contemplated. Does that change our automation assumptions? Does that change our workforce plan? What does it do to customer service agents? All of that now needs to be rethought in light of this new tax proposal. And that's not even a hypothetical, right? It's something that has a likelihood of happening if if the midterm elections kind of go the way that we think they might. So that's how we think about it, and it's also completely configurable. So as we set up for and saying, hey, in case of this event, the impact of which then so ultimately qualifies where that attention needs to be allocated to. That's in the config and the setup of our systems, and so that's how we handle it. So thank you for that question.
Next question. Since the system connects all these different tools, how is it built to be completely cloud agnostic? How is data syncing kept fast if a company is using multiple cloud providers at the same time?
Laman, you want to take that?
Thank you for the question. So getting a little bit into the architecture of our platform. So we have a connector layer that allows us to connect with many different sources, including multi-cloud integrations at the basic technical level. Part of our smarts on top of it is a combination of what we call our semantic layer and worldview layer. So we describe the problem, we ingest and understand the problem space, and bound it to something that is tractable and computable, right? So not the entire universe of open spaces, but within the context that the domain warrants and the problem warrants. Within that context, we are ingesting and mapping data, both streams, event streams, as well as polling data into that worldview and semantic understanding of the world. And from there, we detect signals and we form hypotheses and we optimize for the equilibrium that is the goal of the system. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Vlaman. We're going to go ahead now and keep the questions coming. We are answering all these questions on text directly back to those asking. So please do keep bringing them in. We're going to go ahead and roll now to first survey. These are very short questions, but it is very important that you do answer them. And keep in mind when you answer them that obviously specific for your organization, but please do select as many answers apply. So it's not just a single answer, it's as many apply. So if we can get that set up here and just put that on the screen, here is your first survey question. One other thing I'll say too is please do scroll down with the bar so you can see all the answers. Okay, let's roll to the next question. Okay, and then the last one. Let's roll to question 3. Okay, and this is all about unexpected news and changes in pivoting currently in your organization. Let's go ahead and we're going to move now and we're going to end the survey here. Thank you all for participating. We're going to now move into a conversation between Emily Binder and Art Fitz. And take it away, Emily.
Thank you, Steve. Art, let's talk about the future of healthcare. Obviously, you've had over 30 years in healthcare, 25 as managing director at Deloitte. You've been focusing on building AI directly into health plan ops, claims, utilization management, provider systems. We're talking about automation. What do people get wrong about this? How do you see the future of work in healthcare?
Good question. I think, if you just think about kind of backing up to where Rajiv even started, right? The cost of labor in the market, right, is about $4 trillion in just healthcare itself. And then that management and coordination layer that he pointed to is somewhere in the, trillion to trillion and a half number. So staggering numbers. And that's healthcare, that's, nurses, doctors, also, on the health plan side, a ton of clinicians, a lot of people that just doing a lot of administrative things and aren't really working at what I like to think of as the top of their license, which is really, I think, what this is about.
I know you love that phrase.
I do.
What do you mean they're not working at the top of their license? So what happens? Are they replaced? I mean, we just saw token costs go from 1.2 million to 7 million year over year. But where's the ROI? That's the other side of this. Are we just spending the money and then not seeing the results?
Uh, I don't know if, I think there's some results there. I mean, we've had good outcomes. I think it depends on just wh where you go then and how do you pinpoint kind of the place. I mean, have you used like GPT Health?
Yes. And I definitely want to talk about that. I have used it.
So
Very
you're you're
powerful.
you're one of 40 million people a day who's using it. It's like 5% of all of the
Right.
requests on GPT. So powerful tool, potentially. Also, potentially a place to drive a lot of cost, right? Because just imagine if the GPT gives you the highest cost, solution to every medical problem. You go ahead, you sprained your ankle, you
Mhm.
go get an MRI, pick the thing, right? Set lots of doctors.
Yep.
So it drives you really to a place where you could really see cost escalating very, very quickly.
I told it that my bunion hurt and it said you should go get an MRI. And I was looking this up. This is pretty mind-blowing, but it says that according to University of Oxford, nearly half the time AI chatbots like ChatGPT Health give inaccurate or incomplete medical advice, frequently under triaging emergencies or suggesting wrong dosages. That sounds dangerous.
And they even tried to bound the models significantly to say don't give advice, and people just continue to do it. So I hope your MRI goes great, but I mean you can see the cost problem,
I don't
right?
really need one.
You can see the cost problem, you can see the utilization problem, and I think that's really the question of how are payers going to react to this? How is the world? Maybe it's not a payer, right? Who's going to react to this navigation to the right source using these tools? There's clearly a gap, right? Everybody's using it, so there's something missing in the system today that can direct a human to go to get the right care at the right place, the right time. We know how to do it. Like there's the rules are there, but it's if there's the opportunity now is the signals underneath that can really drive you to the proper outcome in a coordinated way with the risk and the transaction and all of the navigation that a payer has to today. Somebody has to kind of manage that stack.
Right. In looking at these publicly traded payers, and we're talking United, Humana,
Yeah.
Cigna, et cetera, they were outperforming the S&P by a wide margin right up until 2024, and then the bottom fell out. So if you look at, you're saying one of these payers could emerge as a $1 trillion company if they get this right, what would that look like?
I mean, that's what it is, right? That it's seeing all of the moving parts, right? So they there's like I said, three components of it, right? They deal with transaction at the bottom layer. There's a layer of risk that they manage, and then it's the navigation of the human through the health system, which they're actually pretty good at. But as this kind of gets decoupled now because GPT is giving all the navigation directly from the other pieces, there's some that break has to be corrected, and that's there's ways to do it, and I think that's really where the opportunity lies. And really is I think what SignalOps is building that could really help pull those pieces back together and coordinate it appropriately. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
You did some really good research here.
Always. I'll hand it back to you, Steve. Thanks, Art.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Art. So we're going to go now into second survey here. These will probably go faster than the first, and then we're going to go into Raj's closing. So if we can go ahead and just put in that second survey. Here we go. The most valuable to your organization over the next 12 months. Again, select all the answers that apply, please. And then next question. The most likely to hold your organization back from getting value in AI. As we know, the latest MIT reports and whatnot about many organizations not getting value out of their AI investments to the level they thought. Terrific. We'll hang on for another 5 seconds as they're coming in right now. Everybody should be selecting number 1. Okay. And I think we're good. Raj, I'm going to hand it off to you here.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for all of our attendees. It was a pleasure. A lot of great questions. Certainly learned a lot from the questions themselves. So, since we're running over on time, I'll be brief, and I'll leave you with this one last idea, which is, as I said in the beginning, as AI becomes ubiquitous, as it has already become, then what is the competitive edge for any enterprise? What makes you different? And I think that is, in fact, the scarcest resource, which is attention. So attention is not something abstract. It's the very foundation on which enterprises need to be building their future. And that's something that needs to be guarded as a precious asset because it's finite and it's scarce. And therefore, a system that figures out how to allocate attention best and enables you to be the most competitive that you can be, and maximizing all of your assets, your distribution, your data, your intelligence, your talent, all of that being metered and orchestrated by SignalOps based on our SignalOps platform, which allows you to manage talent and tokens together, as well as our broader offering, which includes SignalOS and Equilibrium and memory and attention routing and Signal Graph. All that together enables you to be the best that you can be, so that rather than being the blockbusters and the Kodaks of this generation, you could be the next trillion-dollar company. That's our hope for you. We hope that you book our demos and look forward to connecting soon. Thank you all.